Hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth video in our FastAPI series. In the previous video, we explored different HTTP methods, created APIs for each one, testing them in Swagger documentation. Today, we are taking this further by learning how to send data to our API endpoints using different types of parameters in FastAPI. In FastAPI, there are multiple ways to pass parameters to our endpoints. We will begin with query parameters. Query parameters appear after the question mark in the URL. That's their defining characteristics. If you recall from our last video, all the APIs that we created were actually created using query parameters. Let me show you an example. When I execute this API with user ID 1, notice the URL structure. We have our base path followed by a question mark, then our parameter. Let's look at another example. This post request. I will pass user ID 11, new as the name, new either example.com, and some random values to phone number. When we execute this, observe the URL. We have user ID, we have question mark, user ID equals to 11, then an ampersand separator, and then name equals to new, then another ampersand, then email equals to new at the example.com, and finally the phone number. Notice how multiple query parameters are separated by ampersands in this query parameter. Query parameters have some important characteristics. First, they are optional by default if you provide a default value. For example, if I set a default value to phone number. Let's give a default value to phone number. And reload the Swagger docs. You will notice in Swagger that this parameter has become default, has a default value and it has become optional, while all others remain required. Secondly, you can make them required by not providing a default value or by using ellipses. Third, query parameters support multiple values and list types. Actually, there are two ways to define query parameters in FastAPI. The first and simpler method is defining them as regular function parameters, just like we have been doing. The second method uses the query class from FastAPI. Let me show you. I will remove this default value and use the query class. We can also pass other parameters like description and some validations also like greater than and so on. Let's see this in Swagger documentation. This is the description that you have kept. So we can define query parameters using both the methods simply by defining parameters as function parameters or by using the query class provided by FastAPI. So there may be a question that has been raised for you, that is, why should I use the query class? We use query class because there are several advantages of using it. We can add descriptions like this that appear in our API documentation, and we can also perform advanced validations like greater or equal, less or equal, minimum length, maximum length, or any other regex patterns for validations and so on. However, for simpler cases, defining parameters directly as function parameters works perfectly fine. Let me address you something very important. Earlier, I used query parameters to get the details of the specific user in this get user API, but this is not ideal. When we are identifying a specific resource, we should follow REST principles and use path parameters instead. So we are moving to path parameters. So what are path parameters? Path parameters are used when the value is the part of the resource's identity. In our case, the user ID identifies which user we are accessing, so it should be part of the URL path itself. Instead of slash get user and then question mark user ID equals to 1, we should be doing slash get user slash 1. This is the path parameter. Similarly, for user ID 2, the path would be get user and slash 2. This is cleaner and more restful. Implementing path parameter is straightforward. We define them using curly braces in the path. So we just have to give a curly brace and pass the path parameter. That's all. So if we see here and reload the docs and pass a user ID 1, notice the difference. There is no question mark in the URL anymore. The parameter is part of the path itself. Let me highlight you some important characteristics of path parameters. They are always required by default. Which makes sense, isn't it? Because we need to specify which user we want to retrieve. And the third characteristic or third point is that FastAPI provides automatic type conversion and validation. If someone tries to pass a string where an integer is expected, FastAPI will handle the error automatically. And the fourth point is order matters when defining multiple path parameters. They must appear in our function in the same order as in the URL path. So, when should we use its type? We should use the path parameter when the value identifies a specific resource like a user ID, product ID, or order number. And we use query parameters for optional filters, sorting, pagination, or any additional data that does not identify the resource itself. Now that we understand query and path parameters, let's talk about the third and most important type, request body parameters. This is essentially crucial when working with post, put, and patch requests, where we need to send large or more complex data. So let me show you something. This is the API that we had made, add user API that we created in the previous video. Let's take a look at it in the Swagger docs. When we open this endpoint, notice how all the parameters user ID, name, email, and phone number are being passed as query parameters. You can see them listed in the parameters section with the question mark notation in the URL. While this technically works, it's not the best practice for several reasons. The first reason is query parameters are visible in the URL, which we had seen earlier, isn't it? And secondly, URLs have length limitations. And imagine if we have 20 or 30 fields to send, then it would be hectic. And third, it does not follow REST conventions. For post requests that create resources, we should send data in the request body, not as the query parameters. This is where query parameters come in, and request body allows us to send structured data, usually in JSON format, in the body of the HTTP request rather than in the URL. To use the request body parameters in FastAPI, we need to create a Pydantic model. Pydantic is a data validation library that comes built in with FastAPI. Let me show you. First, we have already imported the base model from Pydantic, and let's create a model for our user data. So it contains user ID, as integer, name as a string, email as a string, and phone is a string. So, what is a Pydantic model? First of all, think of this Pydantic model as a blueprint or schema for our data. It defines what fields like user ID, name, email, or phone number, what fields we expect, and what type each field should be. And FastAPI will automatically validate incoming data against this model. Now let's update our add user endpoint to use this model. What we can just do is remove all these query parameters and just use that user model that we had, oh sorry, user input model that we had defined. And now let's access all those user IDs and name and other fields using this user. Notice the key change. Instead of listing out individual parameters, we now have just one parameter user of type user input. And this tells FastAPI to expect a JSON object in the request body that matches our user input model structure. And let's save this and refresh our SWOT documentation. See the difference. Instead of query parameters, we now have a request body section, and FastAPI automatically generates a JSON schema based on our Pydantic model. And if we try this API and try this API, we can see a pre-filled JSON structure, isn't it? Now let me fill some actual data. I will enter user ID 12 and name can be something like Garima, and email can be some random things and some random digits on the phone number. When we execute this, notice the request URL. It's clean. Slash it's just slash add user with no query parameters. And if we look at our request body section, you can see our JSON data was sent in the body of the request. Let me highlight some important characteristics of request body parameters. First, the data is sent in the request body, not in the URL, making it secure and suitable for sensitive information. And the second key characteristic is that it supports complex nested data structures, complex data structures, and not just simple strings and numbers. And FastAPI provides automatic validation based on our Pydantic model. If someone sends invalid data, FastAPI returns a clear error message. And another thing is it generates automatic documentation in Swagger showing the expected structure. So and there is no size limitation like with URLs. We can send large amount of data through request body parameter, and we can also make our Pydantic model even better by adding validations and descriptions as well. Let me show you. I will import field and email str from Pydantic, and in our user input class we can pass the field and give this a latches and say that the user ID should be greater than 0. And this I can also provide a description to user ID. Fire. So now our model has a requirement that the user ID must be greater than 0 and name must be between 1 and 100 characters, and email is automatically validated as a proper email format using this email str type, and each field has a description that appears in the documentation. So we can see it in our Swagger docs. We need to install email validator to use the email str. So let's if we refresh the Swagger docs, you will we can see that there are changes reflected in the API and in this user input also. We can see all the descriptions and validations that we had implemented, and let's recap quickly all the three parameters that we have covered so far. First of all, we discussed about query parameter, and query parameters just appear after the question mark and they're optional by default and used for filters and optional data. For path parameter are part of the URL path. We use the parameter to identify a specific resource, for example, user ID. And the third one we discussed is request body parameter, and in the request body, in this parameter we pass the data as request body as JSON, and it is used for creating or updating resources with the complex data. Example, post request with JSON payload. And for the best practice, we use path parameter for resource identifiers like IDs. We use query parameters for optional filters, sorting, and pagination. And we use request body for post, put, and patch operations where we are sending structured data to create or update resources. And that's it. We have now covered all three major ways to pass parameters in FastAPI, that which are path parameters, query parameters, and request body parameters. Understanding when to use each one is crucial for building clean and RESTful APIs. And that was all in this video, and see you next time. Thanks for watching.